If the Northwest Territories wants to move toward true reconciliation, then the governments, the federal government and the territorial government, have to deal with this issue. They can't leave it out there and just turn a blind eye to it.
BECK, also known as Rocher River, a little-known chapter in the history of the Northwest Territories. It's a story of colonization and relocation, one that continues to impact the people who still call the land home.
They say in our language, "Nietsakalder." They say, "Nietsakalder," that means the boss of the land. However, Canada was not supposed to be the boss of the land. They're supposed to look after the land for us. They're supposed to look after the land for our people.
After the community was abandoned in the early 1960s, the Tatsotene people of Rocher River were scattered throughout the north, forced to join other bands by the federal government.
I want to see people, my people, holding their heads up and being proud of who they are and being title holders. But that's been taken away from me too. You know, I'm like what you call a refugee in my own lands.
In the years that followed, the Tatsotene have fought to hold on to their culture, tradition, and identity, and seek answers for the historic injustice that was forced upon their people. For the last 67 years, mushers from across the country have gathered here on the shores of Yellowknife Bay to celebrate their culture and tradition.
3, 2, 1, go! Off they go! Canadian Championship Dog Derby in 2021. Here they go, running for the 50 miles. All the way.
It's a test of skill and endurance that's been passed down through the generations.
The dogs determined your quality of life in the north before. The better quality of dog team you had, the better life you lived. And so as a young boy growing up in the north, I realized that everything we needed for survival, to thrive in the north, came from the dog team.
They are a different breed of athlete, and their names have become legendary throughout the north. Tatsotene families that trace their roots directly back to the Tulsen River and the community they once called home.
People in the Tulsen River, they took a lot of pride in especially my family, took a lot of pride in being able to train sled dogs because they knew the connection to your quality of life, and they just, it's something that became just second nature to our family, is to work, train, and to care for sled dogs.
For Scott McQueen, dog mushing isn't just sport or recreation. It's a way of life, a family tradition that keeps him connected to his culture and identity. His father, Danny McQueen, was a champion musher and dominated the sport in the 1960s, a tradition that continued even after the Tulsen was dammed and his family forced to leave Rocher River.
People felt they had no choice. It's what the government was going to do, and they were right. I mean, the government of the day, if they wanted to take land, they went in and took it, and that's exactly what happened here. The people knew that they didn't have a choice, so they started to make plans to relocate their lives and to begin a new life someplace else.
APTN Investigates heard similar accounts from a number of communities where the Tatsotene people were relocated. Stories of hope and resilience, but also of families being torn apart and a way of life destroyed. Our journey eventually led us to the small hamlet community of Dene-Nuquin, Fort Resolution, Northwest Territories.
I see genocide as when you take away a person's identity, their religion, their culture, their language, and their title.
Ronald Mackay's family moved to Dene-Nuquin after the school in Rocher River burnt down. They had little choice once the federal government began to enforce compulsory attendance laws for school-aged children.
I look at it as slavery. I look at it as political slavery, where the government controls everything we do. We have no say in the matters, our rights. If we want to fight for new rights, they're the ones who decide this. We had human rights before they came here. That's been taken away from us too.
Mackay has done much of his own research over the years on what really happened in Rocher River. He says it can all be traced back to the signing of Treaty 8. For the Dene, it meant peace, friendship, and a coexistence. For the Government of Canada, title and control.
I have a copy of the Treaty 8 document here. For the Yellowknives, Chief Snuff, Zen 2 signed for Fort Reliance, and Artisan signed for Jean River. Chief Snuff signed for the lower part of Tulsan River, called Rocher River. So this document in itself proves who signed for who.
Historic evidence that the Tatsot Dene of Rocher River were original signatories to Treaty 8 as the Yellowknives, guaranteeing their inherent rights would be protected and the land maintained for future generations. A promise that was broken once the people were forced to relocate.
A letter from the Regional Supervisor District of Mackenzie Indian Affairs Branch came up with a letter stating that they were going to transfer our people to the Fort Resolution Band, move our band structure to Snowdrift, and put the Black Lake band members on there. This is the document.
And what does that mean to you? What does that document mean? What does that say?
Genocide. For me, that means that they've taken us from who we are and put us on another band, and they've got another band of people taking over our identity.
It was a decision that the Tatsot Dene had no say in, and one that would essentially erase their people from the history books.
The thing about it is they've reneged on the deal. So that's the thing I think the government is doing, is removing us and moving us to different bands, so we have no idea of where we're from, who we are, and where we belong.
This is Saskatoon Island behind Rocher River by Snuff Channel. And
It's a sentiment shared by many of the Tatsot Dene that still live in Dene-Nuquin to this day. For Kevin, Catherine, and Laura Boucher, the history of Rocher River is directly tied to the people who called the land home from time immemorial. What would you guys like to see happen?
Our people get back together. I'd like to see all the Rocher River people, whether you're Métis or Dene, back together as one Tetsanotine. That's what I'd like to see.
I'd like to see us get recognized as a people, and as Rocher River too, like that. That's where we belong, and I'd like to see us get respected for that, and not disregarded.
Yeah, I like to see that as well, because like I said, you know, there's so much things that's been happening there that we're left out, we're not consulted with.
Recognition, respect, and a seat at the table. Treaty rights that the Tatsot Dene have been fighting to reclaim for the last 60 years.
I want our identity back. I want our culture back. I want, you know, like our lands back, at least a say in how they're being developed, you know, and our religions, you know, the things that we hold sacred out there. We have so much people buried out there, and it's all being, you know, plowed under because nobody cares anymore.
APTN Investigates had planned on making the 50-kilometer journey from Dene-Nucoin to Rocher River by snowmobile. But warm weather and overflow made the trails impassable. Our time on the road had come to an end, but for the Tatsotene, the journey was far from over.
Sazi Arthur Beck Zulia, that this shot the Neon, Jabulish shit on the Slinguli. Yeah, my name is Arthur Beck. I'm born in Yellowknife, raised on Tolson River, an old village called Rocher River.
This is where Arthur Beck feels most at home, breaking trails on the land and tracing the footsteps of his ancestors. Beck volunteered to take APTN Investigates up to his family's cabin at Rocher River, but weather made the trip impossible. We caught up with him here, on the shores of Yellowknife Bay.
I am the true Yellowknife. My grandfather is Chief Snuff, 6 generations on my mother's side. He signed the treaty July 25th, 1900 in Port Resolution for our people, the Yellowknives.
Beck's family never really left Rocher River. Both his parents were born along the Tulsen and continued to live there, even after the river was dammed and the people forced to leave.
My grandfather, Pierre Freezy, at the time was the chief in Rocher River, and he went against the dam. He did not want that dam in there. Before the government interfered, Rocher River everybody was self-sufficient. But then the government in the early 50s, according to my grandfather, they were talking about, they found some lead in Pine Point and they needed power. So they looked at some rivers, and Tulsen River is the one they selected.
It's a decision that would seal the fate of the Tatsotene people of Rocher River. And according to Beck, the impacts from the Tulsen are still being felt to this day.
We have cabins all the way up Tulsen River, and they're all flooded. All our equipment this year was under ice. We couldn't even trap if we wanted to. All our traps, our cabins are ice right up to the windows. We can't even get in the cabins. All our equipment's frozen under ice right now.
These images show what Beck discovered. He believes that a large amount of water released from the Tulsen Dam was responsible. When he investigated further, he found there was missing data from the federal government's flow charts that track the water levels at Tulsen.
There's no flow chart. There's no data for 1 month. You know, you can't blame that one on COVID. Computers and instruments do not get COVID, so you can't blame that on COVID. So as far as I'm concerned, our people are concerned, is they're hiding stuff from us. That's why it's missing. How could you miss 1 month of data?
The NWT Power Corporation is owned by the territorial government. They have denied its operations at Tulsen played any part in creating the high water levels downstream.
The problem with the government is they do not tell the truth. They don't tell the truth. They don't care. They don't care about people. All they care about is the mighty dollar and the power.
It's a bold statement, but given the government's historic treatment of the Tatsotene, it's easy to see why they're mistrustful. Over the years, there have been many attempts to reinstate the Rocher River Band. Scott McQueen and his family were part of the most recent push back in the late 90s.
Basically, the federal government said that they weren't going to open any negotiations with a new group, and if we wanted to be included in negotiations, we had to get the ACHO to agree to include us as part of their negotiations, which they refused to do, in part because each of the negotiating ACHO groups had something to lose.
The ACHO have been negotiating a land claim agreement with the federal government for the last 30 years. They are made up of 3 First Nations in and around the south side of the Great Slave Lake: the Dene Nukwai, the Lutselke Dene, and the Yellowknives Dene First Nation.
In this picture here, this is my grandmother's cafe, and there's my grandfather Dan McQueen Sr. in the back.
A traditional name that the Tatsot Dene from Rocher River maintain was taken away from their people.
The Yellowknives Dene from Dilo Deta took the name of the Tsotine people, the Yellowknives. The Fort Resolution Dene Nukwai took the land area. They started moving in and harvesting that area. And the Lutselke First Nation, they got the actual band memberships. And so it just, this injustice that the federal government created just is perpetuated by these other groups because they stand to lose something.
It remains a contentious and sensitive issue for the ACHO to this day. The Yellowknives Dene of Dilo and Deta are also recognized as Tatsot Dene and also have rights to the traditional name. In the end, talks with the federal government fell apart.
I guess it wasn't unexpected. I mean, they don't want to have to compensate people, you know, and if they can put the blinders on and pretend that didn't happen, that's a benefit to them.
According to Arthur Beck, there is no word in Tatsot Dene Yati for reconciliation. He wasn't surprised by the federal government's stance on Rocher River. They maintain to this day that the community has never been recognized as a band under the Indian Act, even though they entered into treaty as the Yellowknives more than 120 years ago.
People are different now. They lost their respect, they lost their culture, they lost their knowledge, they lost their language. I was lucky. I didn't lose my language.
When he's not out on the land, Beck can be found here at the Northwest Territories Legislative Assembly. He works as a translator, sharing the traditional language of his people, his way of keeping the Tatsot Dene culture and identity alive.
I still speak my language very well, and my language helps me in my traveling, in my culture. The language is the culture. It tells you about the land and everything, the animals, the plants, everything. It's all in the language.
Language, knowledge, and culture. 3 pillars of Indigenous identity that Scott McQueen has instilled into his children.
And so that pride continues throughout generations, and it's gone through me, from my dad to me, to my children, and now I see it in my grandchildren. And so just that continuation of history with the sled dogs, it brings a lot of pride to me and gives me a really good feeling inside.
Because Tulson said that the trail's groomed, so...
A sense of pride and connection to the past that McQueen's daughter, Jordy Reed, has also fought hard to protect.
Knowing that family history and that cultural connection that I have with sled dogs just really instilled that, I guess, sense of identity when it comes to being a dog musher in myself. And through that, I got a real sense of pride in being, you know, an Indigenous woman dog musher.
Reed grew up hearing the stories of her grandfather, stories of the land, the Tulsin, Rocher River, the Tatsotene, of the injustice that was forced upon their people.
A lot of your identity comes from your sense of place and where you are in this world and where your family is from. And I feel like that sense of place is really disjointed because of that disconnection from the Rocher River area.
A sense of place and identity that was taken away from the Tatsotene people of Rocher River. Unfinished business that descendants like Reed hope to one day see reconciled.
I'm trying to do that as an individual, but I think it's really important that it's done as a collective as well, where it's, you know, the government and the Indigenous group are reconciling together to help heal those pieces, because I definitely feel that there's something inside of me that needs to be healed. I'm trying to do that for myself, but it's difficult when it's not being done around me.
Back on Yellowknife Bay, the Canadian Championship Dog Derby has entered the last day of the races. Scott McQueen's son, Tulsin, named after the river his ancestors lived on for generations, is representing the family. And even though it's been over 60 years since the community of Rocher River was abandoned by the federal government and the people forced out, if today proves anything, it's that the legacy and the history of the Tatsotene will live on.
When you're a native Indigenous and you come from a place and you come home, there's a connection there. So I know where my people are from. I belong there. You know, this is all who we are. That's how I see Rocher River.
I think the government owes the people of Rocher River compensation, that reconciliation, they call that stuff. This should be looked into. Our people should be compensated for what we lost.
You can't move forward with reconciliation if you still have taken the land from one of the Indigenous landowners and you haven't made amends with them. You haven't given it back. You haven't negotiated with them some sort of process to compensate them for that, you know. And without that, there can't be reconciliation.